Hi everyone, thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speaker for agreeing to participate in this event on Iran after the fall of Assad, organized by ISPI and CARPO. I don't want to take much space from our speakers, so let's begin with the discussion. Assad Al-Achi, Executive Director of Baytna, I would like to start with you. In early March, we saw clashes between Assad loyalists and the HTS and Free Syrian Army, and we saw this in the governorate of Latakia or Tartus. Why this happened, and what was Iran's actual role in these clashes?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. And just to be clear, I was the executive director of Baytna. Right now, I'm the MENA advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions. In terms of the clashes that happened, it goes through two tempos. The first tempo really started with what was perceived as an attempted coup to reverse the new administration in Damascus by remnants of the Syrian regime, who started attacking security forces linked to the new administration in Damascus along the coast, in Latakia mainly, but also a bit in Tartus and in Jabli. After that, what happened is that there was a call for support and rally, and things got completely out of control, and civilians and some other armed actors took up weapons, went from different areas of Syria into the coast, and there were massacres committed against the communities in Latakia and Tartus. It wasn't targeting only regime remnants and regime forces, but actually there were massacres against civilians. The latest number we have is about 1,148 civilian was killed, but we're still documenting. So the documentation is not over. We're still documenting. So that's not a final number. This is a preliminary number in the number of civilians. About 213 civilians out of those are, not from the area, but the remaining are from Latakia and Tartus. And on the role of Iran in all of this, we don't have evidence, hard evidence of any direct implication of Iran, but there are circumstantial evidences of support and of facilitation by the IRGC for remaining, or the remnants of the Syrian regime, to basically gather and to train and eventually try to stir trouble. But these are only circumstantial evidences. There are no hard facts that prove an Iranian direct interference in those events. Until now, we're still documenting, as I mentioned.
Thank you, Assad. Adnan Tabatabai, co-founder and CEO of CARPO and co-partner of this virtual event. Looking more generally at the relations with Damascus, how is Tehran maneuvering to secure a role in Syria's transition, and what can it realistically achieve?
Thanks for this, Luigi, and thank you to everyone being with us here. I guess at this point, it is quite clear to Iran that for the political transition, it won't play a prominent role. There are obviously a set of priorities that matter a lot to Iran when it comes to Syria, some of which are new, some of which are old. First off, access to the Mediterranean has been a key strategic priority, which for now is obviously very difficult to maintain. And secondly, I think the posture vis-a-vis Israel mattered a lot to Iran. And that posture was in part secured through the logistical line to Lebanon and more specifically to Hezbollah, but also through Iran's political influence, some calibrated presence, partnering up with Syrian groups that were in line, partnering up with the Iran-friendly government in Damascus. All of that, of course, has been hit very hard. There is obviously another thing Iran wants to achieve and maintain, and that is more of a cultural dimension to Iran's relations with Syria along ethnic and religious or sectarian lines, the lives of the Shia minority in Syria, the importance of Shia holy sites in Syria, like the Zainabiyya, have been of essential importance to Iran. The life of Alawites, which has been partly mentioned now by Assad. Of course, the events of the past weeks have been shocking for Iran, and I would agree with Assad in that it is difficult to assess what Iran's role may have been in stirring up some of what has happened. But that leads me to one point where Iran can possibly achieve something early on and in this stage, and that is to try and find a way with the new leadership in Damascus to protect Shia minorities, to protect Alawites, to protect their right to practice their religion. We just saw very late into this transition period, however, it still was of importance, the meeting of Ahmed al-Shara'a with representatives of the Shia minorities and Shia clerics. By the way, in Iran, in official debates and discourse, Ahmad Shara'a is still referred to as Al-Jolani. They refuse to call him Shara'a. And that in itself, of course, also means that Iran may have not fully come to terms with the new political reality in Damascus. And here let us compare the situation a bit to Afghanistan, which some people did in 2021 when we remember Kabul fell into the hands of the Taliban. Iran early on continued its, let's say, operational, transactional, however you want to call it, relationship with the Taliban, and some expected or said something similar could happen with HTS or with Ahmed al-Shara'a in Syria. But the key difference, of course, is Afghanistan shares a 920-kilometer border with Iran, which is a much more urgent matter for Iran to find a way of coming to terms with the new leadership in neighboring Afghanistan. And in Syria, I think Iran will probably wait things out a bit more, wait to see how things evolve. Obviously, there has also been an economic dimension, regular trade, energy supplies, but also sanction circumvention, illicit trade that happened in a lot in and around Syria. All of this is arguably cut off at the moment. And so this leaves Iran currently with trying to prevent a too hostile posture of the new leadership in Damascus towards Iran, trying to see whether it can develop into a more functional relationship. There was a news item a few days or weeks back that one of Iran's ministers was invited to Damascus. I haven't heard more about this yet, but it would be interesting to see whether the colleagues know more about this. And I think that's as far as things can currently go. I think it's more beneficial for Iran to currently stay out of what's going on and observe the transition and see whether there are openings in one way or another that may come up. But for now, it's basically a loss that has to be absorbed, and I think it is also getting absorbed and digested. Back to you, Luigi.
Thank you, Adnan. Burçu Öczelik, Senior Research Fellow in Middle East Security at RUSI. So regarding the Kurds, there have been reports that Tehran had contact with the SDF leadership in an anti-Damascus strategy. So is this truly the case? And if so, what impact could it have on SDF-Damascus relationship, even in light of the recently signed agreement between Ahmad al-Shara and Mazloum Abdi?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's good to be on. I think there's a high level of uncertainty surrounding the prospects for Iran to reconstitute its influence inside Syria. And a key area of interrogation, of concern, of course, is with respect to Iran's potential links or engagement with the SDF. And there has been a high level of speculation and some accusatory language emanating from Ankara as to the possibility that Iran has an open line of communication with the Kurdish-dominated SDF and could possibly use these channels of communication to stir up instability within the northeastern part of Syria and potentially beyond that as well, in areas of concern to Turkey. Of course, Turkey considers its border areas along the Turkish-Syrian border as of existential threat and a vital national interest, given the wider issue at stake, which is, of course, over the PKK, a designated terrorist organization, and Turkey considers the YPG, YPJ, which are the armed militia factions under the SDF umbrella, as the offshoots of the PKK. So that is the backstory. In terms of Iran's more recent engagement with the SDF, you will recall that there was a tit-for-tat sort of exchange of harsh rhetoric from both the Turkish and the Iranian foreign ministers in early March, where Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan expressed Turkey's concern over the possibility that Iran was engaging directly with the SDF. And I think it's true, and many analysts have argued that Iran is certainly looking for bargaining chips or means to create leverage within Syria after having sort of lost its projection of influence and power there following the fall of Assad. The minority card, to put it quite crudely, I think, identity politics, the deployment, the instrumentalization of minorities, such as the Kurds, is seen as one way in which Iran can possibly reassert itself into the Syrian theater. Iran, of course, has denied that it has been engaging with the SDF. SDF commander has also said that, well, the SDF directly have said that, refuted that they have had direct engagement with Iran. But the backstory, the backdrop to this, of course, is that Iran historically has played a very complex, multifaceted approach to its relationships with various proxy groups and armed militia. With some groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, perhaps we can, and we certainly can, draw a more direct line of continuity of support, both ideologically and in terms of supplies of arms or military training. But it's been particularly complicated when it comes to the Kurds, the Kurdish armed groups in Iraq and Syria. And on the surface, a common denominator concern of national interest for both Turkey and Iran, of course, is the threat of Kurdish separatism. And this dates back to the settlement in the Middle East following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the First World War, where the Kurdish populations were divided across the borders of Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. And each, particularly Turkey, Iran, have experienced, of course, decades of separatist ambitions by the Kurds. And this links Turkey and Iran's interests. But from Turkey's perspective, or Ankara's security and defense establishment's perspective, Iran has played sort of a dual game, a dualistic approach when it comes to Kurdish separatists, and that they have treated armed Kurdish actors within Iran and those that seek to destabilize Iran differently. They've treated them as terrorist organizations, whilst they have played off against each other groups in northern Iraq, as well as the PKK, which targets and has historically targeted Turkish national security since the 1980s. And so this has been a persistent thorn in the side of Turkey-Iran relations, that Ankara has found it troubling that Iran doesn't categorically reject the PKK in the harshest terms that Ankara would have liked. That in covert, behind the scenes channels, Iran has in the past been alleged to support the PKK, whereas its arms training, certain supply chains, or support in some form, empowering, enabling, for example, Shia Iran-backed militia to help the PKK in some of its operations or expand its theater of maneuverability in northern Iraq. And we saw, of course, different sides, Turkey and Iran, play off against each other, various Iraqi Kurdish factions inside northern Iraq during the 1990s there in the civil war between the two factions in Iraqi Kurdistan. But without going into too much detail about sort of intra-Kurdish rivalries and the geopolitics of Turkey and Iran, the point being is that this is a long-standing issue. And now, of course, with the very severe change of power in Syria, the balance of power between Turkey and Iran having shifted so dramatically, this has opened up a new front, or renewed that front of competition between Turkey and Iran when it comes to the Kurdish groups and the SDF. Now, the SDF, as you mentioned, have signed a principles agreement, I would call it, historically of significance with Damascus. With Ahmed al-Shaara's government. And this was welcomed by Ankara because it could spell the beginning of the end for the PKK as we know it, as an armed group. Of course, the developments in Syria with respect to the SDF, the dissolution or the disbandment of the SDF, the YPG armed groups, and their integration into a unified armed structure at the Damascus level. This is clearly linked to the parallel process at play, which is the dissolution of the PKK as a terrorist organization. Now, these are two parallel tracks, and the clock is ticking on both in tandem and separately as well. So they're very closely intertwined from Ankara's perspective. Ankara is closely monitoring the developments when it comes to the framework agreement between the SDF and Damascus. We are in the very early phases of what this agreement will look like. As always, the devil is in the detail, and this will be worked out. I think we have until the end of the year. That's the timeline, the window of opportunity by which the SDF and Damascus will arrive at an agreement regarding the technicalities, the mechanisms by which the integration of SDF armed forces into a national unified armed structure will emerge. And we have seen early signs of what that could look like in terms of certain agreements emerging over the last few days, even in terms of Kurdish-dominated neighborhoods around Aleppo, and the integration of YPG into a local police force or internal security services, for example. And could this be a blueprint for what could happen in other areas of Kurdish majority control as well? But there are many questions there in terms of what the evolution, the pace of these developments will look like. Again, if we zoom out, a key driver of the intensity and the pace of these discussions between SDF and Damascus, where Turkey and Iran are watching, is of course the looming possibility of a US troop withdrawal from northern Syria. And this is driving the interests of Turkey and I would say Iran as well, because this will open up strategic opportunities, let's say, for regional actors. And this has long been the case, but it looks as though, again, tentatively, that if President Trump, the US administration, seeks to pull out its troops from northern Syria, this will open up potentially a new phase of competition. And I think what Turkey is trying to do in linking up the progress between the PKK and the disbandment of the PKK and the SDF Damascus agreement in parallel is to get ahead of the curve and to be prepared for when the US troops do withdraw, when they withdraw. And I suspect Iran is also watching these developments very closely to determine whether that will provide them with that competitive edge that they've lost since the fall of the Assad regime.
Thank you, Burçu. Assad, before shifting to a broader regional perspective, I would also like to hear your opinion on Damascus-Tehran relationship. So what remains and what does the HTS, the Damascus government, intend to do with the remnants of the Iranian presence in Syria in terms of hardness of power?
Well, I think we need to differentiate between two things: the relationship with the Shia community and the protection of Shia shrines in Damascus, and the relationship with Tehran. What we've seen is two things. One, the Iranian embassy in Damascus being ransacked. Photos of Khamenei and of the current presidents being torn out, slogans of "Free Iran" on the embassy, etc., etc., etc. Those were the early days after the fall of the Assad regime. But very quickly, I think within a week, the new administration provided protection to the embassy in Damascus. The embassy is still closed. Obviously, there are no Iranian diplomats in the embassy, but the embassy now is kind of protected, let's say, kind of by the current administration. So then we have the messaging towards Tehran from the administration itself, which has been fairly interesting, I have to say. It hasn't been very adversary. It was more based on a relationship of a state to a state based on mutual respect and non-interference in internal affairs of both countries. Whether there were several statements, whether by Shara himself or by Shibani, his foreign minister, that Iran is an important regional actor and that we cannot go for too long without a certain form of a relationship with Iran. So really, as of January, we've started seeing that messaging coming out of Damascus, which is conciliatory in a sense, but also trying to keep Iran completely at bay, saying, yeah, we'll figure out that relationship later on at an arm's length, because obviously their priority has been elsewhere. On the flip side of this story, if you look at what the Americans have been saying over the past month, I think, finally the U.S. administration, the Trump administration, is starting to make statements about Syria. And there are, several conditions being put on the administration. Probably number one or number two is prevent a return of Iranian influence over Syria. And it's clearly stated, and it's been stated by Rubio himself and by different State Department officials on the discussion with a potential relationship with the new Damascus government. So it's clear there is a lot of pressure from the U.S., at least, that no relationship between Damascus and Tehran is allowed. I would say the position of the Gulf, mainly Qatar and Saudi Arabia, is more nuanced. The Qataris and definitely the Qataris, but also the Saudis, understand that Iran has interests in Syria, and those need to be eventually discussed. And I think Doha is wanting to play some role of a mediator, but that's just a speculation from my side. It's not information. That Doha eventually will play a role of a mediator between Damascus and Tehran to reestablish some form of a relationship. But I don't think this is a priority for any time soon. It will come, but not now.
Thank you, Assad. Adnan, so the fall of Assad has posed significant challenges for Tehran in terms of supplying weapons and financial support, mainly to Hezbollah. In response, Hezbollah appears to be pursuing a second phase of Lebanonization and relying once again on popular mobilization as its primary political tool. So this was evident during the Hezbollah-led parade that celebrated Israel's partial withdrawal from southern Lebanon a parade that also penetrated Christian neighborhood, but we also saw it in the demonstration following the flight blockade from Iran, and most notably at the funerals of Hassan Nasrallah wa Hashim Safieddin. Given these developments, how will the relationship between Tehran and Hezbollah be reshaped, and what will be the main challenges ahead?
Yes, I think it's beyond question that on the one hand, Assad and Syria is a loss for Iran, and on the other hand, at least that's how I see the discourse in Iran. Hezbollah is not lost, but is significantly weakened. And here, an important differentiation happens in the debate that I observe, and that is that the hardware of what Hezbollah has as capabilities, has at its hands, that has been hit. But the software, so to speak, the ideas behind it, the commitment to resisting Israel, to resisting US influence in the region, all that more ideological aspect, the leadership in Iran believes is very much intact. I'm sure that they also take notice of some of the grievances, some of the severe criticism that existed among Hezbollah supporters, but also Hezbollah members last year in fall about Iran not having prevented the killing of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. So you could argue that that software has also been weakened, or that the cohesion within Hezbollah has been hit as well. So that will have to be restored as well. It's not going to be just about the hardware. It's also going to be about the ideational level, about the software, as I would refer to it here. That ideational level, that software level, I think Iran will, with the long-term view it always has, probably work on with a lot of patience, that goes far beyond what, let's say, we in a European discursive realm can think of. That will be the long game. So for now, what you hear some Iranian officials also saying is, yes, we have lost a set, but we haven't lost the whole game yet. We will just sort of regroup, re-energize, etc. Regrouping, re-energizing, the biggest challenge obviously will be the restoration of the hardware that I referred to. So the logistical line through Syria is obviously disrupted. Whether or not it is disrupted entirely, that's another question for those who watch satellite images day in, day out. But there are air routes, there are speculations about how Iran and Turkey could discuss affairs in Syria, with Iran giving some concessions to Turkey there, while Turkey allows Iran to use its airspace, all of that. But that is, to use Assad's way of putting it, more speculation than information, but you hear a few things along these lines. What I would also like to reiterate here is that the future relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, unsurprisingly, will have to be different in nature, because what the relationship between Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and Hassan Nasrallah was really a relationship, or it evolved into a relationship on par. Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah could be mentioned as Iran's ears and eyes in the Levant. It was much more a mutual give and take of assessments, advice, information, etc., rather than a one-way direction coming from Tehran. So the importance of Hassan Nasrallah, who over the decades, and this is not a normative assessment I'm sharing, I'm just sharing the type of figure he was. He turned much more into a politician than the leader of an armed group. It is a hybrid group, and part of that hybrid group is the political identity, which is closely linked to the state of Lebanon. And of course, the new leadership, Naim Qassem or whomever, is going to be different, at least in the initial years. So, and I would have to admit that I also have a lot of question marks into how this relationship will develop. It will be different. There will be the continuation of the ideological aspects, the ideational aspects. And here there is a lot of confidence in Iran that the overall context around Lebanon, the Levant, the situation in the Palestinian territories, the continued attacks happening, that this will actually galvanize the whole idea of resistance. Whether or not that leads into the same sort of capabilities, that's the big question. But I think this is a space where we will see a lot of shifts back and forth that will also have a lot to do, I guess, with how Israel positions itself in Syria. Will Syrian territory continue to be occupied? How will that, after a few months, after 1 year, after 2 years, play out inside Syria? How will that play out in Turkey? How will the government of Erdogan or any future government in Turkey react to anti-Israeli sentiments within their own ranks? How will that all play out? And this obviously will have a spillover effect on Lebanon. There's no question about it. But I have to say, I'll be humble here about trying to assess how that future relationship will look like. But I think some of the important points that we need to look at were the ones that I wanted to mention.
Thank you. Burçu, another key actor that played a significant role in Syria was the Popular Mobilization Forces. At first, these pro-Iranian militias supported Assad, but then they left Syria, leaving the crucial border crossing unprotected. So, given their withdrawal from Syria and the upcoming parliamentary elections in Iraq, what level of influence can Tehran still exert on them? What role could they return to play in Syria? And finally, what are the implications for the control of the Abu Kamel crossing?
That's a really interesting question. And of course, given the very close linkages between Iraq and Syria, for a number of reasons, this is going to be very important to track, continue to monitor in the near and distant future. So for Iran, of course, Iraq is hugely significant and has been so since particularly post-2003. Iraq serves as the land bridge for Iranian access into Syria and Lebanon. And the prospect of losing its influence in Iraq is severe for Iran for a number of reasons. Again, the symbolic issue of ideology, of reputation, of power projection, as well as its economy. I mean, for many reasons, Iraq has served as the economic lungs of Iran, particularly given the severe stranglehold of sanctions. Iraq has served to be very instrumental in helping Iran through this process. But now, of course, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashd al-Shabi, they have it's almost a crossroads. I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which this is an issue of debate inside Iraq, but at the same time, it is hugely significant. There is a debate underway in the Iraqi parliament over legislation, a law that would govern the future of the PMF, certain rights and responsibilities, where it would sit within the Iraqi sort of state system. Of course, the PMF has been under the influence of Iran for a number of years now. And over the past few months, especially, we have seen increasing pressure from the United States upon the government of Iraqi Prime Minister Soudani to curtail the influence of Iran over the PMF forces. And this has placed a fair amount of pressure upon Soudani, especially because this is election year, where we're in the months leading up to the parliamentary vote. And Soudani is trying to balance these demands from the United States, as well as Iraqi popular sentiment internally that has become somewhat frustrated with Iran's overreach. into Iraq. So there is, I think, that's important to point out as well, because we tend to talk about Iraqi politics as Iraq is sort of the playing field of regional actors, but there's also a change within Iraqi domestic constituency public opinion as well, in terms of a greater desire for Iraqi sovereignty, standing on its own feet, limiting the encroachment of regional actors, be it Iran or be it Turkey. And so there's that. And of course, there's the Iranian pressure to continue its legacy of influence inside the Iraqi system. And the PMF plays a very important role in that sort of power dynamic there. So again, pressure to limit the PMF's influence. This is hugely consequential for the future of the Iraqi state system, both from a security and military point of view, from a foreign policy making point of view, and the domestic shuffling of internal power politics as well. There has been sort of counterclaims from some of the more dominant Shia or Iran-backed Iraqi militia within the PMF, where they have been more vocal in expressing their grievances about developments in Syria. There's some itchy feet among some of these armed groups that are keen to get involved in the Syrian theater. But of course, this has been curtailed, as we saw around the time of the fall of the Assad regime. But more recently, for example, Al-Khazali said that, the leader of AAH said that they were witnessing there was problems with Israel's attempts to create what he called a Kurdish state across Iraq and Syria, suggesting that this could be a long-term threat, not only to Syria, but also Iranian interests as well. And so I think, as Adnan was saying, we are in the very early days of a protracted period of transition and political change within Syria itself, but will have implications for Iraq and certainly for Iran. The Israeli occupation of military presence in southern Syria may, if continues and even expands, it becomes more fully entrenched, will likely draw more agitation within Syria itself, but also embolden Iran-backed groups who see this as a justification for their re-engagement inside Syria. And of course, Turkey will also, already is facing sort of the prospect of greater tensions with Israel, or potentially a confrontation because of competing visions for Syria and also territorial ambitions inside the country as well.
Thank you, Burçu. I'm sorry, but I would like to continue with you. So in light of the so-called flanking of the so-called axis of resistance, how are relations between Iran and other regional state actors being reshaped?
Well, we've talked about the axis of resistance as waning in influence, certainly in decline, given the post-7th of October security climate, the conduct of the war inside Gaza, the weakening of capabilities, of military capabilities, and projection of force pressure from Hezbollah and Hamas. But I think it's important to sort of track the shifting of power dynamics, the center of gravity within the axis of resistance, increasingly to Yemen and the Houthi movement there, as well as Iraq, of course, potentially being the next front line in terms of the possibility of US strikes against Iran-backed groups in Iraq. And this is something that we've been observing closely since these tensions have begun to escalate more clearly following direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. So that's one layer of complexity, is the shift within the axis of resistance itself, and how these groups are trying to realign both ideologically, but also recover their access to supply chains, material capabilities, arms and supplies, and so forth. And so I think there we're going to be seeing a lot more activity, and we are already, aren't we, with the confrontation against the Houthis and their resilience in the face of renewed U.S. strikes. In Iraq, of course, we've already talked about. But in terms of regional actors, I could speak most directly about Turkey, because in the post-Assad Syria, Turkey has been described and certainly sees itself, I think, from Ankara's perspective, as being on the rise, and Iran is on the back foot in terms of this matrix of winners and losers. And we can debate this, I think, in different directions. But this has been the general portrayal. So Turkey and Iran appear to be on, I wouldn't say a collision course, but certainly tensions are increasing, particularly as Turkey sees itself as having gained superiority over the Syrian theater, its influence with Al-Shara and the interim caretaker government in Damascus, and Turkey, of course, having a historical neighboring country to Syria, having hosted over 3 million refugees over the course of the Syrian war, sees itself as having a stake in the future of the country. But on this subject, I would also note that despite mainstream media portrayals of Turkey having sort of uncontrolled, unbridled ambitions for Syria, I think there is an awareness within the establishment in Ankara that there are structural constraints on how far it can go in Syria, that it understands those natural barriers. Syria is an Arab majority country. It belongs in the Arab world. And so it's important from Turkey's foreign policy perspective in posturing on the Syria file that Syria develops closer ties with the GCC countries, namely Saudi Arabia, of course, which will have, the thinking goes, a strong role, a big role in funding the economic recovery of Syria. It's also important, of course, that Syria normalizes with the West, however defined, but certainly the European Union states have been taking a far more constructive and proactive approach to engaging with the new government in Syria. Talks of lifting sanctions that have been crippling key sectors in Syria, the critical, developing critical national infrastructure. These are areas in which European Union states seem to be more willing, particularly after the announcement over the weekend of the new cabinet, the transitional government in Damascus, more willing relative to the United States to engage with Syria, to help the economy begin to recover genuinely. So I think if we were to focus on the Turkish foreign policy side, there is an awareness that Syria needs to have a multifaceted approach to its relationships with regional actors. But of course, in the Arab world, there is caution because of the ideological lineage and the baggage that HTS comes with in terms of its previous links to Al-Qaeda. And this has created tensions and some hesitation with certain countries in the Gulf, Qatar, as well as Egypt, that have been more skeptical about engaging with the government. So again, it's early days. Sometimes I feel as analysts and certainly in the media that we are very hard on Damascus at the moment. It's only December 8 that the regime was toppled after decades of tyranny and a closed authoritarian system. And steps so far have been I think, moving in the right direction in terms of the messaging that Damascus has been sending. And again, cautious but optimistic signs over the weekend and the announcement of the new cabinet.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but Adnan, as you can imagine, I would like to ask you something about Iran's nuclear program and the ongoing mediation efforts. So in October, the UN sanctions related to the JCPOA are set to expire, and today diplomatic efforts seem to be increasing. We currently see 3 active channels: the Beijing track, which also involve Russia, the Geneva negotiations with the 3 countries, and mediation through Gulf actors, particularly UAE and Oman. Which of these channels should be watched most closely, and what is happening beneath the surface?
I'll try to make it brief, Luigi. Obviously, all of this will also matter greatly in how Iran positions itself in the Syrian theater, if I may call it that. Obviously, the situation around Iran's nuclear file and the situation between Iran and the US, because that's ultimately what matters, is extremely dynamic, extremely volatile. Things that seem to be important today can be totally irrelevant tomorrow. We have not now just one actor, namely Tehran, that sends mixed signals, but we have now two. The same holds true for the US as well, where you really have contradictory statements. It's not just nuanced, it's outright contradictory. So for each side to figure out what's really at play will take time. For all of that, the different channels are relevant. And let's just, when we start with regional countries, let's remember that Saudi Arabia was really trying to position itself as a good interlocutor, as a good mediator. The same, the Qataris, but the Emiratis ended up bringing the letter from US President Trump to Iran. And then the Omanis were those who took the letter from Iran back to Washington. In a good scenario, this is a good, coordinated, healthy division of labor. In a bad scenario, of course, this is an uncoordinated mess that will prevent a properly streamlined process towards any sort of diplomacy. So I think all of these channels have their merit right now, and all of these will, in an ideal scenario, feed into helping particularly Washington and Tehran to come to terms with the path that they want to pursue. And in order to again come back to Syria, I think the idea of US troops leaving Syria and the remnants of Iranian influence in Syria can potentially help to be a point of discussion on the table. But I don't think it goes beyond that. And similar to what I said earlier, which of the channels is going to be the most important one, that's really impossible to say, as we have seen multiple changes and shifts in the past days. So that's going to be extremely volatile and dynamic.
So, Assad, last but not least, let me conclude by turning back to Syria. I would also like to hear something from Damascus' point of view. So, what are the interests of HTS, of the Damascus government, in rebuilding a different relationship with Iran, and what should it aim for? You already answered a little bit on that, but you're muted.
My understanding from spending some time in Damascus and talking to the different officials that have taken over the government is that they're trying to apply a policy that President Erdogan, back then Prime Minister Erdogan, had, which is zero problems. The zero problem policy, and that's what they're aiming for. So they want to try to normalize relations with everyone, even with the contradictory item, with contradictory objectives or contradictory countries. So as I was mentioning, the messaging to Tehran was conciliatory in January, but the messaging to Israel from December 8th until today has been conciliatory as well. Israel continues to occupy more and more Syrian land. They're about, the latest I've checked, about 15 kilometers from Damascus. And we still haven't seen, a kind of a forceful statement coming from the Syrian Foreign Ministry. We still hear messaging of peace and wanting and being exhausted from war and not wanting to fight anymore, and therefore wanting some form of a negotiated peace. There was a leak yesterday that there are back channels being established already between Damascus and Tel Aviv on what that peace can look like. So I wouldn't be surprised to see back channels being established as well fairly quickly between Damascus and Tehran to try to see what kind of relationship both countries could have. And my understanding is that the focus of the Damascus administration is very much internal. is on rebuilding, is on consolidating, well, first consolidating power, second rebuilding, and third really try to build some form of a consensus inside the country. So they want as little problems as possible with foreign actors, no matter what that foreign actor is or who that foreign actor is. And they're trying to delegate some of that, to their allies, if we can say so. So another, for example, rumor, and that's purely a rumor that is speculating, that is spreading at the moment, is that Shara will meet President Trump in Saudi Arabia when President Trump visits in May. That's another rumor circulating, but that tells you a bit the mood as well. They're trying to delegate, some of that relationship with the international community to what they perceive as their allies. Their two strongest allies or perceived allies at the moment are Turkey to the north and Saudi Arabia to the south. Those are the two kind of entry points, let's say, for the Damascus government. And they're trying to benefit from that relationship with Turkey and that relationship with Saudi Arabia to normalize relationships with the rest of the world. We've seen that with Egypt, for example. And as I think Adnan mentioned, or Burçu, that the relationship at the beginning was very, very difficult between Damascus and Cairo after the fall of the Syrian regime. But eventually that relationship was somehow normalized, and we saw Shara in Cairo being received at the Arab Summit, the emergency summit for Gaza. I think we'll see more and more of that. And that's what I was speculating on, that I think that role will either be delegated to Riyadh or Doha, basically to eventually normalize the relationship between Damascus and Tehran. They will need a mediator. It can be either or. It's very hard to tell, as Adnan was saying, it's very hard to tell which channel will work. But I think Damascus is looking at back channeling at the moment.
So thank you once again for attending this second event in our series on the regional implication of the fall of Assad. We look forward to seeing you at the next event on the implications for Moscow. Bye.